Ha, ha. Shields and swords, feel the wars, fighting my blood down to the core. Warriors from medieval age, fear the reign of night brigades. Crusades into the room, moving through the temples and tombs. Scared in place, prepare to face Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
Hello Minions, today I want to do a review for you of a film called The Breakfast Club from 1985. And so this film is 30 years old, over 30 years old, so I will be completely free with the spoilers. So expect spoilers in this if you've never seen it. And the reason it's on my mind is because a couple weeks ago the local movie theater had a retro movie night and they showed it, and just a few days later the Criterion Collection announced that they would be adding, among its list of other titles to be added in January, would be The Breakfast Club. And so it's a little bit on my mind at the moment. And I want to present to you The Breakfast Club as an antidote to the current spate of young adult film franchises. You know, Divergent, Hunger Games, Maze Runner, these sorts of things. And they deal a lot with these ideas of cliques in high school and teen anxiety. And I think one of the things that people sometimes think about these films is they're generally kind of dumb. And I think sometimes people think they're dumb because they think, oh, teens and their anxieties are dumb, or teens and their concerns are dumb. And in fact, that's not it. It actually has more to do with the way that they present those problems. One of the big and so there are two things that I'm going to push back against a little bit, and these things are what are true throughout these types of films and young adult novels. And The Breakfast Club almost feels like it's pushing back against those, even though it predates those. And the first one is this idea of cliques, different cliques in high school. In the dystopian future young adult novels, there are always these cliques that are there, and they are being enforced really by adults who want to divide the teens from growing up and being full adults and overthrowing the despotic regime of the adults. And you know, I have to say that not only was that not my experience in high school, but as far as I can tell, you know, talking to other people, both my contemporaries, people a little older than me, a little younger than me, all those schools have had cliques, and I assume still have them. They're very, they're much more fluid than film and television makes them appear to be. The other one is something which I think is important for The Breakfast Club, is that these dystopian future and other sorts of young adult films suggest that cliques are there and they're enforced by adults as a way to keep the children low and weak. When in fact, I think the reality is that they're self-reinforcing. And I think this is true. Anyone who's graduated from high school knows this. All the things that you thought were important in high school, the second you cross that threshold into adulthood, none of that stuff matters anymore. You know, being in this clique or that clique in high school doesn't matter anymore. And so it's hard to see ways in which adults are really the prime movers. Certainly adults will pigeonhole children or teachers, students, as we see in all of these. But by and large, those social divisions aren't being enforced by adults, and sometimes adults are a little oblivious to them. And so how does The Breakfast Club manage to get at this in a much more sophisticated and interesting way than say, a Divergent or Hunger Games or something along these lines? Well, partly it's the very stripped down, simplistic setting of The Breakfast Club. This isn't a dystopian future. There aren't robots and lasers and, you know, other sorts of weird futuristic technologies or social situations we're not accustomed to. This is set during Saturday detention at a high school. Almost 90% of it takes place in one particular room, this high school's library, so it frankly very easily could be done as a play. It's very static in that sense. And so the little bit of action that occurs, such as the children, the teens running around the high school, is minimal and not cartoonish in the same way. Both the cliques each get to speak for themselves. It's not simply an external representation of them, but they each get to speak for themselves, and we get to hear their critiques of one another. But also in those critiques, which happen earlier on in the film, we begin to see that in some ways their understanding of the world is not entirely reliable. They are not presented as being super worldly wise, but instead their view of the world is as limited as any other 17-year-old's view of the world would be. And so because of that, when we see this microcosm of high school society, this is in a sense a microcosm of society larger, but also has the same limitations as other kinds of microcosms. We see this, for example, in the Canterbury Tales, where Geoffrey Chaucer creates the set of pilgrims, which is a microcosm of society, but all the pilgrims have limitations. All the pilgrims have ways in which they have prejudices that they bring to the table that are a problem. And as the reader, you're supposed to see through this. And I think one of the things that John Hughes does is he presents them as meaningful and significant and rounded characters, but also presents them as being flawed. These aren't the flawless heroine of whatever the latest young adult fiction or film franchise will be. And so where the Breakfast Club is going to gets us to the end, where we see this kind of closing quotation that Anthony Michael Hall gives, where he basically kind of breaks down the idea of the cliques and says, we each of us have in us each of these categories in us, and that's one thing that we recognize. But in this, there's this constant tension and sadness that is, I think, much more realistic, but also much more significant and important than you'd see in these young adult dystopian or films and books. The idea in those is that the adults are trying to keep us down. It's the adults trying to keep us down because that's how and this, I think, prays to the kind of the dumbest and most ridiculous but common teenage anxieties, the sense that the reason I can't grow up is because the adults won't let me, not my own innate immaturity. And so all you have to do is overthrow the adults and everything will be better. The Breakfast Club, on the other hand, once we've been presented with these characters as flawed, we then get to hear about their parents through their voices. But we already know that their view of the world is limited, and so we see truth in their representation of their parents, but we also see that their truth is limited by what they can understand. So, for example, in case after case after case, we begin to see that the clique that they're in, the social category they're in, is really in many ways determined by their parents. Their parents' attitudes have shaped them, and there's this question as to whether they're, at one point, they question whether they're going to become their parents, and Ali Sheedy's character says it's unavoidable. Or sorry, she says inevitable. When you grow up, your heart dies. Now, it isn't clear that the idea that your heart dies is there, but rather we see in this sense that the children are fulfilling roles that their parents established in their own lives, and presumably their parents also did the same thing. And there's this sort of cycle that the parents are no more or less to blame for as the teens are, and the teens have to fear that if they don't break out of these class rules or these clique rules, that they're going to end up in the same state. And I think to help us get to that, John Hughes gives us the two main adult characters in there, Mr. Vernon and Carl the janitor. And Vernon is depicted as the main adult antagonist. He's the one in charge of the detention. And in many ways, we see Vernon as a kind of authority. They see him as an authority figure. And Carl raises the question, what would 16-year-old you think of you today? But for adults watching it, we see Vernon as a little bit of a pathetic figure. He's someone who's very concerned with the way that these teens think of him. He brags about how much money he makes, and he owns and that he owns a home. But the amount of money, he gives us a specific dollar amount, and even in 1985, it's not a crazy amount of money. It's a middle class amount of money, and he's inordinately proud of being in the middle class. And we can see from the way that he dresses that he's very interested in fashion and the way that he presents himself to the world. And it strikes us as a little pathetic that here is an adult man who's still worried about what these 17-year-olds think of him. Now, Carl the janitor could have been presented as a complete foil to him and to say, well, he's foolish and Carl the janitor is wise. But that's not at all what the Breakfast Club does. Instead, first we see Bender, John Bender, making fun of Carl the janitor. Bender, the person who's most likely to end up like him, is the one who makes fun of his social position. Second, then we see Carl the janitor giving a kind of speech where he, in essence, boasts about, I'm the eyes and ears of this school, and I read your notes, and I look in your lockers, and I listen, and I know what's going on. And it's a sort of threat. It's sort of his way of saying, I know everything. You guys think that I'm not watching, but I'm always watching you. But again, although it's marked by social class differently, how's that any different than Mr. Vernon being interested in what these kids think of him? Why is following along with all the micro dramas of this high school, why would you be proud of that? Why would you think that's a defense of your life to be that way? So the hopefulness then at the end of the Breakfast Club is not that they're going to overthrow the adult regime. We do have the sense at the end that John Bender was going to have to come back again and again and again. We do have the sense at the end that it's going to be difficult for them to really maintain public relationships once they get out of here. They have a long discussion about that. But we also see that they have a willingness to see beyond those. And the closing speech slash essay that Anthony Michael Hall's character gives gets at this idea, not that they refuse to acknowledge these cliques, but that they see themselves as inhabiting all of them, a kind of sense that we are all in some way connected and inhabit one another. And so in the perhaps the most 80s ending of any movie, which is the John Bender leaping the air and freeze framing with excitement because he has made a romantic connection with Molly Ringwald. In that, we also see a sense that they are able to move beyond these lines, and a hope that when they get to adulthood, not that they'll overthrow the adults in their lives, but rather they as adults will be able to reach across those clique lines, or for adults, reach across those class lines, and be able to have a more meaningful life, and perhaps not quite pass on as much of the damaging part of that to their children. And all this in a movie that's really just about 5 kids who have detention on one day. So thanks for paying attention. And remember, minions, don't you forget about me.